what is apologetics essentially? And one of the go-to verses, we're going to talk about a few things here. And one of the go-to verses for apologetics is 1 Peter 3:15. And what it tells us is, it says to be ready to give an answer. Some versions, some translations say defense. Be ready to give an answer, defense, for the hope that is in you. So when someone approaches you and asks, why do you believe what you do? Biblically speaking, your job is to give a response. And note, this is a New Testament mandate to every New Testament believer, which means if you are a believer in this house this morning, you are commanded by God, not suggested, not saying this is going to be fun, not saying, hey, this would be a good idea. You are commanded to give a response for what you believe and why you believe it. And when you look at the Greek word for this word defense or answer, it is a Greek word apologia, and hence we can deduce this means defense, and apologetics is merely giving a defense for what you believe, why you believe it. The story Phil was sharing, I want to share a couple stories with you about why this is relevant and important. As he was mentioned during the pandemic, this group reached out to me in the Philippines. Great people, great guys. To try and keep the story brief, they said, we've recently started this online apologetics ministry, especially since that we cannot be here in person, because there is a rise of atheism in the Philippines. In fact, it's become, he even sent me an article of how much atheism is growing there. And I said, well, that's great. And he says, yeah, within like a few weeks to a month, they grew to about 2,000 members online. I said, that is fantastic. He said, well, thank you, but that's nothing compared to the atheist group. They have 20,000 members online, 10 times as many. And I said, well, that's great that you're doing this. I said, well, what got you to get this started? And he said, well, and again, young guys, they said, well, we've been trying to get apologetics started in our churches, and the older pastors aren't interested. They don't see the relevance. And I'm like, do they not know what's going on? They said, oh, they know, but they just don't think that's the way to go. So because there was no support from the church, we just started something ourselves. So we did this interview, and afterwards, he was really, I found out later I was their first international guest, and I'm like, well, that's good. You start low, you can only go up from there, right? And he was so appreciative of it, and he said, would you mind debating one of the founders of the atheist Filipino group? I said, yeah, I'd love to. As I'm preparing, as I do with all my debates, I like to watch my opponent, see what he's saying, see what arguments he's giving. As I'm listening, I remember thinking, these are terrible arguments against God. I mean, terrible. And then the first thought that crossed my mind was, if this is the best the atheists have in the Philippines, then I think the churches there are in much better shape than I thought. But then the opposite thought hit me like a ton of bricks. Because then I thought, but if this is the best they have, and yet they're winning, then perhaps the reason the atheist movement is growing is not because they have good arguments, it's not because they have good philosophy, but because the church is comparably silent. So I contacted Zuriel. I said, look, I definitely don't mind doing this. I'd love to do this. I said, but I don't live there. But you do. I said, here's what I want to do. And I talked with Phil. And I said, what if we got, out of this group, what if we got together a group of young guys who feel called to this? Not who are interested, not who think it's fun. I don't want a big group. I want a small handful of guys that you trust, that you know personally. And I actually later found out a lot of them never met in person. In fact, I just saw a post a few months ago that for the first time, some people from this group met each other. And I said, just give me a small group. I said, and I will devote time maybe once a week, once every other week. And there's a big time difference, by the way. I had to wake up about 5 in the morning and then do some philosophy for a couple hours. And we had about 10 to 15 guys. And for about almost a year, every other week, I think we did 30 plus sessions. Like, I don't know how many hours that totaled to. And I said, let me train you guys to do this there, because again, I don't live there. And if there's a rise in this movement, well then, let's get you to get grounded. Let's do some training, and then I want you guys to go out and do that as well with others. Like Phil was saying, about a few weeks ago, the guy that contacted me said, hey, one of the pastors in the area asked if I'd start a Bible study at this church on apologetics. And he said, hey, I started taking classes in theology. Hey, now they want me to start training to be the head of the department in the future. Hey, we've started 2 now online groups. We have this apologetic one, and then some guys in the area said, hey, let's do one on specifically on theology. So I think they have now 2 or 3 groups. And these are bright young people, training to be doctors, some lawyers, bright young people. And to see the fruit of this. But it goes back to this. Be ready to give an answer, a defense, for anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. And here's another story that doesn't have a happy ending, if you will. I was invited some years ago to a church to speak. This was before Texas Baptist. I won't mention the name of the church. Meet me out, slip me a 5, maybe we can talk. The pastor wanted to have lunch. And as we're talking, he says, I think apologetics is good and all, but I just don't think it has a place behind the pulpit. Well, I'm about to preach at his church, so I'm not going to argue with him, right? And I said, well, we can agree to disagree. That night, thankfully my sermon was not on apologetics that night, but as I go to the stage, the youth pastor brings me up and says, take a few moments to introduce yourself. So I briefly mentioned my role as an apologist. And I said, but hey, if you have questions, see me after the service and we can talk. After my sermon, I come down to my seat, I'm gathering my things. And I see from the corner of my eye this young man and his mother just marching straight towards me, fast. And they get right in front of me and they stop. And the young man says, he points at me and says, tell her you said we could ask you questions, right? And I thought, oh my God, did I say something wrong in my sermon? I'm trying to replay it. Was I off? I said, yeah, is everything okay? And she looked at him, looked at me, and said, well, as long as you're okay with it, I'll let y'all talk. And she walked off. And I said, what was that about? Is everything okay? And what he said next completely broke my heart. He said, well, I'm an atheist. I don't want to come to church, but my mom forces me to come, so I come. But I've always had questions. And as I began to ask these questions to those in my youth group, and they couldn't answer these questions, they'd send me to the youth pastor. When he couldn't answer them, they sent me to the pastor. And it's gotten to the point to where they sat me down, and they had a meeting, and they said, if you're going to come to church, sit down, shut up, and stop bothering people with your questions. But then he looked at me and said, but that rule doesn't apply to you because you don't come here. And you said we could ask you questions. So if you're okay with it, can I ask you some questions? We talked for at least an hour, if not more. So much so, the guy with the keys to the church said, you have to leave. My wife and kids are waiting at home. As I'm exiting, we're still talking. Bright young kid, great questions, and he was appreciative of the answers. And I said, I'd answer a question, we move on. I said, well, wait, are you satisfied with this answer? He's like, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I could see that there was more time that was needed. And I said, look, I'm going to have breakfast with the pastor tomorrow. If you'd like, I can talk with him. And if he's okay with it, I'll give you my cell, my personal cell, my email. We can continue the conversation. He said, that would be so great. I would appreciate that. As we're having breakfast the next day with the pastor, without wasting time, I said, Pastor, I know what you said about apologetics yesterday, but do you know you have an atheist in your youth group? It's a small town in Texas. There's only one high school in the whole town. I said, if you lose this young man, he's taken at least half those kids with him. He said, yeah, that's so-and-so. We're praying for him. I said, it's going to take more than that. And I put out my card. I said, out of respect for you, because it's your church, I didn't want to give this to him. If you're okay with it, here is my personal cell and email. Would you hand this to him? Because I told him if he'd like to, we can continue the conversation. That was almost 10 years ago. Never heard from the kid. Doubt he ever got it. Matthew 5:13. I'm reminded of something Christ said. He said, "You are the salt to the earth. But if the salt loses its purpose, its function, it is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and walked on by people." Now, because there's such a wide technological gap between the time this was written and now, I find the point of this illustration is often missed. And I want to briefly break this down so you have to understand in these ancient times, there were no refrigerators where you could go and store meat for long periods of time. So what they would do is they would take salt, and salt acted as a preservative to prolong the shelf life of meat. Are you with me? So, because I've seen a t-shirt once of this church said, add your flavor to the earth. I'm like, no, stop it. That's not what he's saying. Don't do that. So, with this cultural context in mind, now let's look at this. Given the illustration, what would the salt represent? Who was the salt to the earth? Us. You, me, the church. So, given the context, what would the meat represent? The world, the culture that we live in. I ask you this morning, is the meat going bad? Turn on the news. But consider this. Suppose you live in these ancient times and you go to the local market. You buy a bag of salt. You come home and you begin to add this salt to various pieces of meat. But you begin to notice that no matter how much salt you add, no matter what type of meat it is, it continues to perish and spoil just as it normally would, as if there was no salt to begin with. If this continues to happen, here's essentially what he's saying. If this keeps happening, at some point, you have to step back and stop asking what's wrong with the meat. And at some point, you have to step back and objectively ask yourself what's wrong with the... When the meat goes bad, according to Jesus, he does not point or blame the meat. He looks at the salt. You are the salt of the earth. Question just for contemplation. What would you say is the biggest threat to Christianity? And before we go there, here's where I want to lay this foundation. If you're taking notes, I encourage you to write down the word stronghold. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 4 and 5 says that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal but mighty before God for the overthrow of strongholds. Now, this is a passage concerning spiritual warfare. And essentially, it's given us a context for what spiritual warfare encompasses. And the first thing it says is that spiritual warfare is for the purpose of tearing down strongholds. Now, the next question becomes, what's a stronghold? Without going into the details, we'll just let the next verse define it for us. And it says, inasmuch as we refute, tear down, and destroy. And then it says, arguments, reasonings, and every high and proud thing that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Which means, biblically speaking, a stronghold can be defined as thoughts, ideas, reasonings, philosophies, arguments, presuppositions, any idea, belief, or set of beliefs that go against the knowledge of God. And according to Scripture, this is quite literally the spiritual warfare within our culture. So I can put it this way. A person cannot come to knowledge of God or a deeper knowledge of God with such strongholds. Now, here's what this tells me. If you want to be effective in evangelism, if you want to be effective in spiritual warfare, and if you want to be effective in discipleship, then you cannot do it without the discipline and task of apologetics, biblically speaking. I didn't write the book, I just read it. If you take issue, take it up with the author. But note, you are to give an answer to anyone who asks for the hope that is in you. You are the salt to the earth, and you are commanded by God that to engage in spiritual warfare, this will encompassing identifying, recognizing, addressing, and responding to the strongholds that we find within our culture. The beliefs that will hinder someone from coming to a salvific knowledge of God. And this is quite literally spiritual warfare, according to Scripture. Now, a few things here. There are three dominant strongholds within our culture, and I want to go through an example of one of them. And disclaimer, I talk fast because I have ADHD and I'm Hispanic. So thank you for laughing at my mental disorder. So at the end of this, I'll give you a link where you can download my slides for free. I have some material I'll talk about later if you'd like to get as well. So within philosophy, if I can use a big word, the $5 word is within the epistemology. It's a branch of philosophy. It's essentially the study of knowledge. There is a stronghold that is not necessarily dominant within our culture, but it is dominant amongst the atheist worldview, and it is known as skepticism. Now, note, this is far more than merely being skeptical about a position. It's an epistemology. It's a theory of knowledge. And there's lots of things to say, but I'll put it this way. For the skeptic, there are a few key features of skepticism. One is the idea that knowledge requires 100% absolute certainty. So, for the skeptic, if the possibility of doubt arises about something, you cannot claim to know it, because it would follow you cannot be certain, 100% certain. And if you can't be certain, you can't claim knowledge. Now, whether you realize it or not, you may be familiar with this. Anybody know who Renee Descartes is? What is he famous for? What does he say? I think, therefore I am. Now, what he was doing in essence was responding to this idea of skepticism within his culture at the time, because again, if the mere possibility of doubt arises, you cannot claim to have knowledge because knowledge requires certainty. So he said, well, wait a minute, because a skeptic will say, well, the problem is that nothing can be known for certain, and if nothing can be known for certain, well, then you cannot claim to know anything. But Renee Descartes said, well, wait a minute, time out. Even if I can doubt my own existence, sure, can I doubt my existence? Sure, I can doubt it, but wait a minute, who's the one doubting if not me? Which means by the very fact that I can even in principle think and doubt that I exist, it follows that I am thinking, and if I think, therefore I must be. I think, therefore I am. So at the very least, I can be certain about my existence, because to even doubt my existence, I must first exist in order to doubt it. Hence, I think, therefore I am. Now, who cares? So suppose you're witnessing to a non-believer who holds to skepticism. And it's not necessary that you call them a skeptic. They may not be familiar with the terminology. But while we won't get into this, some of the breakouts may touch on this. When we look at the case for a resurrection, there's only two things that make Christianity true. God exists and he rose Jesus from the dead. If that's true, Christianity's true. All bets are off. But what do you do with this passage? Did Christ rise from the dead? Yes. Okay, well then set that aside for now. Christianity's true. Hey, this just happened. Right. Did Christ rise from the dead? Yes, Christianity's true. Now, we can wrestle with these, but these do not disprove Christianity. Setting that aside for now. Within the case for the resurrection, one of the facts, Gary Habermas, one of the leading scholars in the resurrection, has what's called the minimal facts approach, where he says, here are facts established historically by virtually every scholar who studies the subject, including atheists, agnostics, non-believers, etc. And here are a few facts we can take to the bank that historically speaking, we know these happen, and now we require an explanation. One of these facts is what's called post-mortem appearances, that Christ appeared to people 3 days after he died. Let me reiterate what I said earlier. Skeptics, non-believers, atheists, agnostic historians grant, yes, I believe it was Gerrit Ludemann who said, I know for sure they experienced something. Now, obviously they're non-believers, so they would argue that what they saw was perhaps a hallucination. I'm setting that aside for now, but one of the arguments is post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And at one point, Paul says, if you don't believe me, there was 500 people that saw him. Paul is putting his credibility on the line, saying, don't take my word for it, go research it for yourself. Some of these people are still alive. Now, suppose you're sharing this case with a skeptic, and he says, well, wait a minute. Why would you trust what these people claim to have seen? I said, what do you mean? He says, well, has anybody ever been driving down the highway and a mile down the road you see what looks like a puddle of water? And as you drive closer, what happens? It disappears. Why? It was a mirage, right? And so says a skeptic, that's happened to you. So what that shows us is that your senses have deceived you before. Yeah, I suppose you're right. My senses have deceived me. And could it be possible that your senses could be deceiving you now? Sure. I've had very vivid dreams where I thought I was really somewhere only to wake up a few seconds later. Now, I don't think I'm dreaming now because I have pants on, so I think we're good. But suffice to say, sure, I suppose it is possible my senses are deceiving me. And so says a skeptic, well, if you cannot trust your own senses today, in the 21st century, with all our scientific advancements and our knowledge and technology, if you can't even trust your senses today, how can you trust the senses of what some ignorant, uneducated, illiterate, scientifically unknowledgeable person who claimed to have seen something 2,000 years ago that had this likely Bronze Age superstitious mentality? Because if you cannot trust your own senses, then you have room to doubt. And if you can doubt it, you can't know it. And if this is part of your case for Christianity, I can't claim to believe that because on my view, that would be irrational to do. Stronghold. And with someone like this, even if they're asking questions, their questions may not necessarily be because they're looking for genuine answers. And they may be, but here's the point. It also may be the case that they genuinely believe that if you cannot know something for certain, you cannot believe it. And every question just furthers their uncertainty. And now you have a stronghold that's difficult to overcome. But you are the salt of the earth. How would you respond to something like this? Let's do a quick response. So, I may say this. I like to get clarification. And I may say, well, hold on, how do you know this? And if that didn't sink in, let's make it sink in. You're telling me, Mr. Skeptic, that knowledge requires certainty? Yes. And you're telling me that nothing can be known for certain? Right. But if that's the case, wouldn't it mean that we can't know anything? Yes, now you're getting it. That's right, we can't know anything. Oh, okay, so then just one question. Then how do you know that your skepticism is true? Because if you're telling me we can't know anything, and we cannot be absolutely certain about anything, and therefore we cannot have knowledge, how do you know that what you're saying is true? I was debating an atheist once, Matt Dillahunty, on the existence of the soul. Actually, we brought it with us here. And at one point he said, well, we can't be absolutely certain about anything. I said, really? I said, are you absolutely certain about that? Now, I was actually talking to a skeptic once, and I said, and he gave me this illustration. I said, and by the way, but wait a minute, something about your illustration you used kind of troubles me. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, you told me that I can't trust my senses because I know my senses have deceived me in the past. He says, right, and that shows us that they could be deceiving you now, sure. But here's where I'm having trouble. The only reason I knew that what I thought was water turned out to be a mirage is because as I drove closer, guess what I used to look? My sense of sight. So my sense of sight informed me there actually was no water there, and I was actually deceived initially. But wait a minute. In order to know I was deceived, I had to first rely on my sense of sight to see there was no water. So are you telling me that in order to know I can't trust my sense of sight, I must first trust my sense of sight to let me know that I cannot rely upon it? Or am I missing something here? And by your own standards, if I can doubt something, then I shouldn't believe it because it's irrational. So by your own standards, if I can doubt what you just said, and it's actually what's called self-defeating, it defeats itself, then why should I believe what you're saying? Now, it is funny when you get the answer. But if we can be honest this morning, without raising your hand, who here could have given a response prior to my answer? But you are the salt of the earth. We have the truth. We have the gospel. But let's not just learn how to present it, but defend it. In a world filled with doubting Thomases, let's do what Jesus did. Let's show the evidence. When Jesus encountered a friend that he loved that struggled and wrestled with doubt, most people focus on the verse that says, blessed are those that don't see and believe, assuming it's only about Thomas asking for the evidence. But if you actually read 10 verses before that, it specifies Jesus appeared to the other disciples, and it says Thomas was not present. And Jesus showed the nail prints to these disciples. So 10 days later, what Thomas is asking, he's asking for nothing more than what the other disciples already had the privilege of seeing. And how does Jesus respond? He hits them over the head with the Bible, right? He says, just have more faith, right? Just pray harder. There was two responses. Most focus on blessed are those that don't see, which was not referring to the other disciples. We know that because we know the context. It was likely referring to everyone else who would believe after he ascended, you and I, who have not seen him, yet we believe. Because there's evidence. I'm going to start preaching in a second. And when you look at, they're talking to Jesus and the Pharisees don't believe, the Sadducees don't believe, and they're about to stone him. He says, for what good work do you stone me for? And they say, we're not going to stone you for a good work. We're stoning you. We want to kill you because you claim to be the Son of God and equal with God, and that's blasphemous. It's false. Wait a minute, time out. Are you telling me I can love someone like Jesus loved them, and yet that's still not be enough to win them? Yeah, but you just got to love people like Jesus did. Well, Jesus loved people like Jesus loved them, and they tried to kill him. Why? Not because he was being unchristlike, but because they thought what he said was false and blasphemous. And you know what he said in response? He said, if you don't believe me, if you don't want to take my word for it, then at the very least, believe on the basis of the evidence and look at the works I've done. You are the salt of the earth. I asked you earlier, what do you say is the biggest threat to Christianity? And I'll put it this way, it's not atheist. I know we have a few here today, one who's a friend of mine. It's not science. It's not even strongholds, because there are responses to those. Quite frankly, the biggest threat to Christianity today are intellectually lazy Christians who refuse to rationally recognize and respond to the strongholds in their culture. The only person that can defeat the church is the church itself. Let's go through the dominant three strongholds with the time we have left in our culture. There are three. I'm going to briefly mention what they are, and then we're going to go through, get through some responses. The first one is known as postmodernism, or what's known as relativism. According to this view, truth is relative. We can put it this way. Truth is relative. There is no right or wrong. There is no absolute truth. So suppose I'm standing here behind this podium, and I say there is a dog to the right of the podium. But someone in the front row says, no. There's a dog to the left of the podium. Who's right and who's wrong? We're both right. And in the same way, says a postmodernist, there is no absolute truth. It doesn't matter what God you choose to worship, what religion, what church you go to, because as Gandhi said, you all start at the base of the mountain, and it doesn't matter which way you choose to start. At the end of the day, everybody's going to reach the peak. And there is no absolute truth. So look, if you're against abortion, that's fine, says a postmodernist, but don't you dare impose your religious morality onto someone else, because that is your truth, not theirs. There was a really interesting picture once that was coming out from airlines. And here's what it said. It said, it doesn't matter who you click it with. Happy Pride. It doesn't matter who you click it with. Going on, because, well, actually before, there are three things I want to briefly touch on. And again, we won't be able to go in depth. I do cover this in some material that I brought with me. But a few things, as brief as I can. There are three ways I want us to look at this and learn how to identify these strongholds. 3 C's, church, conversation, and culture. Each of these opposes the church in one way or the other. You can be able to recognize them in culture, recognize them in the church, and recognize them in conversation. So within postmodernism, let me go back for a second. Within postmodernism, there's this idea that truth kind of revolves around the person and their feelings. So you can actually look at a culture's music or what they sing about, because what a culture sings about most will demonstrate the value that they hold to. One guy, I forget his name, one guy said, I don't care who writes the laws of the nation, just let me write the music. Now, let me pause for a second here, because if looking at the music can give you an idea of the presence of a stronghold within a culture, here's a thought experiment. Think of the churches you sing Sunday morning at your church. And as a thought experiment, do this. Take the handful of songs you sing, and I want you to do this sometime. I want you to count how many times the words I or me are used in contrast with the word you or God. Count how many times they'll show up in the song. And then Count how many times the word I, or a conjunction of these words, are used together in a song, but without the verse referring to the benefits you get from being a Christian or how you feel about God. And after you've done that, ask yourself this: is this song about me or God? Can I be honest with you? What I find is, especially songs that tend to overuse the word I or me, aren't songs about God, they're about us. Now, don't hear me saying what I'm not saying. There's nothing wrong with expressing your emotions and feelings towards God, but that should not be at a time that is dedicated to praise and worship of God. Because the more I sing about who I am, then my worship is not centered around who God is, it's around who I am. And then I don't begin to worship God because I think he's good. I worship God on the basis of if I feel good. And then my level of worship is predicated on my emotions, which constantly change and fluctuate, whereas a biblical basis for praise and worship is based on a God's character that does not change. Every one of these strongholds in one way or another have infiltrated the church. Let's look at scientism briefly. It is a view, essentially, we can define it as that science is the only way to gain knowledge. If you want me to believe something, give me the scientific evidence. In conversations, people might say, if it cannot be proven scientifically, it either cannot be known or cannot be true. So, you want me to believe in God? You want me to believe in an afterlife? Show me the evidence. Show me someone who has gone into the afterlife and taken lab equipment with him and come back and show me the empirical evidence. Because if you can't show it to me, why should I believe it? Within our culture, this has created, especially even within our churches, it's created this false dichotomy of either a fideistic mentality where it's all about faith and they define faith unbiblically to mean against logic or reason. And then you have this other extreme that let's make everything about science. Now note, scientism, this is also an epistemology, the word I mentioned earlier. But note, it's not merely an appreciation for science, it's a worldview in which science is the only way to gain knowledge about anything. I remember I heard a minister once, a friend of mine invited me to his church, said we're going to have this guest speaker. He reminds me a lot like you. And when people say that, I want to go because I want to see what they think I'm like. And there was this guy who was a scientist, a biologist if I'm not mistaken, and he said something to the effect. He said, we can now trust the miracles in the Gospels because we now have the scientific evidence to demonstrate how they happened. Okay, I'm open to it. And he said, here's an example. When Peter walked on water, then he started talking about something known as epigenetics. We won't go into the details, but suffice to say that there can be some kind of activation within the genes you have that can create new potentials. And he said something to the effect of the tone in the voice of Jesus and the words Jesus spoke activated the epigenetics in Peter's legs and it caused him to float over the water. And I thought, or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was just a miracle. I'm not sure. Now, don't hear me saying what I'm not saying. I'm not saying there cannot be natural explanations for some things. I don't have the time to get into that, but here's my point. He was not responding to scientism, he was falling prey to it. And because we cannot recognize these, we get in this defensive posture and just begin to fall prey to the very things we should be responding to, not swallowing hook, line, and sinker. This last one really hits home for me. It's naturalism. It is a view that the physical world is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. And this one hits home for me. Freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. The professor was an atheist. I enjoyed it. I was allowed to ask questions. I was eager to learn more because I got in trouble at church for asking questions. I enjoyed it, fell in love with it. And I said, I want to take another class in philosophy. And every one of my peers said, if you're going to take another class, whatever you do not take Professor Pena's class. He's an atheist. He's antagonistic. He's condescending towards religion, especially Christianity. And if you take his class, you might lose your faith. And I said, when does it start and where can I sign up? Not because I wanted to lose my faith, obviously, but because, let me be honest with you, I had questions. I did. And I thought to myself, I know that if Christianity is true, I need to know why. But by the same token, if Christianity is false, I'd still like to know why. And perhaps this guy's the man for the job. Lots to say about my time in this class, but here was a pivotal moment in my life and ministry. He walks into class one day, reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out this antidepressant pill. And he says, now, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And because of this soul, which is supposed to be immaterial, we can have hope in an afterlife and see in our family and friends that have gone before us. And according to Christianity, your thoughts, your emotions, your sensations are all supposed to be immaterial and allegedly also within this immaterial soul. But here's the problem. If I were to take this antidepressant pill, which is physical, it has the power and ability to change the alleged immaterial states and emotions and sensations within my soul. But how can that be? How can something tiny and physical affect the immaterial? Because every time we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing. And every time we look at the body under a microscope, all we find are the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but no scientist has ever come close to finding anything like a soul. And why is that? He says, the answer is simple, and I'll tell you why. The answer is this. There is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You are a physical brain and body, and you need to live with this fact. We need to get on with our lives and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Stronghold. How would you respond to something like that? Because here's what troubled me. In his class, I had heard a lot of complaints against God, but these complaints wouldn't prove Christianity false. But for the first time in my life, I had heard an argument that, if true, would prove Christianity false. Why? Briefly, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if there is no resurrection, I'm paraphrasing, then Christianity is false and people should feel sorry for us because of how pathetic we are and what we believe in. So if there's no resurrection, Christianity is false. By the same token, I would argue, if there is no soul, in principle, there can be no resurrection, and hence, if there's no soul, there's no resurrection, Christianity would be false. Stronghold. I was a freshman in college. Not only had I thought everyone believed in the soul. I never heard an argument against it. But again, for the first time, an argument I heard, if true, would prove Christianity false. How would you respond? Well, we're out of time. If you want the answer, you can get my DVD, A Case for the Soul, back there. It's a whole hour session on this. We do still have time to go through some responses, but since I mentioned it, I might as well allude to it. I did bring some resources with me. He indirectly pushed me into this area. This professor, it was because of him and even influence from the other guy that I was indirectly forced into apologetics. And what sort of troubles me is this. I didn't get into apologetics because I was inspired by some pastor or minister or preacher. I didn't know about guys like Lee or Mark or some of these other I didn't know what apologetics was. In fact, I took the philosophy class because I thought I could skip it because I thought philosophy was just making stuff up and sharing your opinion. And I said, I can do that in my sleep. This would be great. This is good. And yet it was two atheist philosophy professors. Scripture says, if you don't cry out to me, I'll make the rocks do it. These were two rocks in my life crying out. You know why? Because even if God wanted to use a believer in my life to encourage me in this way, there were none. So what did he use? Two atheist philosophy professors. But you are the salt of the earth. What we're talking about here is spiritual warfare. I'm going to, if time, briefly touch on evidence of God. The most expensive thing we have is a 10-hour apologetics course. It's audio. We have download cards as well. For the price of what I mentioned, if you want to make a donation, you can go back there and you can make a single donation and take everything on the table. Some things I won't get into. I did a debate with a feminist lawyer who was, at the time, the executive director of NARO Pro-Choice in Texas, one of the biggest pro-choice organizations of the nation. And we did a debate on a secular college campus. One of my favorite debates, don't have time to share some highlights. I loved it, so much so that sometime after our debate, she was no longer employed with these people. I don't know why. I don't interpret the facts, I just present them. And afterwards, I got to pray with some young ladies. And I had some of the young ladies there that went to the college said, I came to this debate either on the fence or pro-choice, but as a result of this debate, I'm believing pro-life. When strongholds are torn down, the gospel will flourish. Only if you be the salt of the earth. And by the way, full disclosure, I want to be transparent this morning. Anything that you purchase today, all the proceeds, 100% will go to feed a hungry family. Yeah, my hungry family. I have 2 kids who are growing and outgrowing their clothes and eating, and I will take all the help I can get. With the time we have left, let's go into some responses. Postmodernism, there is no truth, and I may skip a few slides just for the sake of time. There is no. I used to work at a school, and a lady said, "Eric, you cannot say Christianity is true because there is no truth." I said, "I have one question then." I said, "Is that true?" Because if you're telling me there is no truth, and yet you're conveying that statement as if it's true, yet if the statement there is no truth is true, then by your own standards, what you just said can't be true, is what we call in philosophy self-defeating. I was invited on a secular radio station once. It was a left-leaning liberal radio station. And every other month or so, as a way to show their tolerance and as a way to show their openness and acceptance of other worldviews, they said, we'd like to invite someone from the community to come talk about their beliefs. Would you like to come on and talk about why you're a Christian? I said, I would love that. Now, I get to the station that day with about 10 pages of notes, 5 or so arguments for God's existence. And as we're about to walk into the live studio, he stops me and says, by the way, are you okay with taking calls? Because not only do we like to expose people to other views, we like to let them call in and ask questions. And I said, sure, let's do it, that's fine. And then he said, now, I don't know if we will get calls. People only call if they find what you're saying interesting or challenging. And last time we had a pastor on the show, we got about 1 or 2 calls the entire hour of the show, but you may get calls. I said, sure, that's fine. At the first commercial break, I'm halfway into my second point. And he looks at me and says, I know there's a lot more you want to talk about, but all the phone lines are ringing. Do you want to start taking calls? I said, sure, let's do it. Guy calls in, and he says, who are you to tell people they're wrong? I said, excuse me. He said, who are you to tell people they're wrong? I was fine with you talking about God. I don't care if you believe in God. Everybody believes in something. But then you start talking about Christianity. Are you telling me that if I'm not a Christian, I'm wrong? I said, yeah, that's how it works. If something's not true, it's false. The law of logic, yeah, that's how it works. He said, well, you can't do that. You cannot tell people they're wrong. I said, okay, just calm down, please. Let me see if I understand you correctly before I respond. Are you telling me that it is somehow inappropriate or immoral to tell people they're wrong? And he said, yes, you can't do that. You cannot tell people they're wrong. I said, okay, well, I just have one last question for you. I said, then why are you calling me on a live public radio to tell me that I'm wrong? If it's wrong to tell people they're wrong. Let's go to the next caller. Yeah. What about what we were talking about earlier? Look at, and that one's funny too. What about this? Here's something interesting. Put it this way, ideas have consequences. False beliefs have consequences. What is the purpose of a seatbelt? Save your life, right? In fact, I saw this tweet. The police department said they're going to be doing seatbelt enforcements. Why though? Well, because it's the law. In fact, they enforce this so much because it could actually save lives. Without wearing a seatbelt, you can get a ticket for not doing this, and they push it because it could save your life. In other words, there is if I could use another big word, a teleological function to seatbelts, meaning there's a purpose and a design to why they were made. But wait a minute. Click it or ticket. It doesn't matter who you click with. This is from an airline, mind you. Let me ask you this. If the plane got in a crash, would this save your life? No. Huh. Would this one save your life? What about this one? Sounds like it matters who you click with. And if I were on this flight and I tried any of the previous, you know what? They wouldn't take off or leave the landing. They say you have to buckle up. Excuse me, are you seat beltophobic? Doesn't matter who I click with. But no, these are strongholds and assumptions. And if we don't learn how to recognize, much less respond to them, the meat will continue to spoil. The meat will perish. You are the salt of the earth. Scientism, briefly. Science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality. So if I just say it's false, and let me give you a few reasons. One, there's lots of things we can know without science. Suppose there's a old lady, and her grandson knows that when she dies, he's going to get a few $1 million of inheritance. The problem is, while she's old, she's also healthy. So, to kind of help speed up the process, he bakes her cake and laces it with poison. Now, she eats the cake and she dies. Let me say this. In philosophy, it's normal to use reprehensible thought experiments to make a point. And you have to be careful who you talk with this about. I was at my house once and I was outside and I was talking to my friend and we were going over some philosophy. And I'm like, so suppose there's a little child who's being tortured in a dark closet. And I'm like, hey, let me go inside. Let's finish this conversation in here. Now, if science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality, we can ask the question, is what this young man did wrong? Yes. Now, if scientism is true, you need science to affirm this. So, what can we do? Let's bring in the world's leading scientists, Nobel Prize winners in their field. We'll bring in a nutritionist, and he can tell us about the nutrients in the cake, how it was digested, and so forth, but even the world's best nutritionists can't tell us whether or not this was wrong. And then let's bring in someone who can look at the body and analyze it. A toxologist. He can tell us about how the poisons fused with the cake as it baked, how the poisons digested in her body, how it broke down her system and eventually killed her. But none of that tells us whether or not it was right or wrong. And then let's bring in the world's leading hematologist who studies blood. Still, he can give us a step-by-step analysis of how she died. But note that after it's all said and done, we would have a full scientific analysis of the situation, but we still don't have any more answers of whether or not it was right or wrong to do it. You're not going to find a scientist that says, oh, by the way, this liquid turned blue. Turns out this was wrong. Or, hey, it says right here in this Petri dish that was morally wrong. Look, you can look for yourself. Why? Because science does not, here's what one atheist philosopher said. Science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise it does not give certain answers. Put it this way, science can tell you what is the case, but it cannot tell you what ought to be the case. And I'll give you one last one, maybe two. It is also self-defeating. Why? To say science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality is itself not something that science can tell you. In fact, that's a philosophical statement about the nature of science and not strictly a scientific one. So, Mr. Non-believer, if you can only believe what science tells you, and yet that statement is a philosophical statement that science can't tell you, then by your own standards, you shouldn't believe what you just told me. Because that is not a scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement about science. And consider this. I've had atheists say, Eric, give me scientific evidence for God. And my response is, and why would I want to do a silly thing like that? And because this is often met with a look of confusion, I explain it this way. Science is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world. But God, if he exists, is by definition, a non-physical entity. So you cannot demand that a discipline like science, which is limited to the physical, be used to try to investigate something non-physical. It is what we call in philosophy a category fallacy. What does that mean? If I asked you, how many pounds does the number 2 weigh, what color is it, and how many can you fit in your pocket? Well, it's a nonsensical question because these categories don't apply to numbers. Or put it this way. Suppose you go to the beach with your friend. 2 hours later, you meet back, and he has this metal detector, and he says, I just made a remarkable discovery. I just discovered there is no plastic on this beach. In fact, I don't even think plastic exists. And confused, you look over his shoulder, and you see the beach is littered with plastic. You say, why would you say that? Of course there's plastic. He goes, no. Because I just spent 2 hours on this beach with my metal detector, and I found a lot of metal. Never once found plastic. And you say, well, of course you didn't find plastic because it is a metal detector, not a plastic detector. It's a category fallacy. In the same way, when I'm asked to demand for scientific evidence for God, It's a category fallacy because it's a wrong tool for the assessment. You're using a metal detector to try and find plastic. Now, without going much deeper, you can use scientific evidence within a philosophical argument that leads to the conclusion God exists. But you cannot get God and put him under a microscope and study it. Just like morality, it is the wrong category and tool for the assessment. Let's look at science. We're going to skip this here. It's good stuff, though. So, the soul. Let's briefly talk about this. Now, I hold to a view known as substance dualism. And before I go here, remember I told you each of these strongholds have infiltrated the church. And let me say this, we haven't realized it. Now, if you've heard this talk before, don't cheat. But a little bit of audience participation briefly. Can you do me this favor? Can you point to what part of your body thinks? Point to what part of your body thinks. Okay. I see this. Brain. Is that where your brain? Does your brain think? Does your brain think? Yes? Okay. Do you need a brain to think? Yes? Okay. Hey, does God have a brain? I didn't hear anything that time. I'm sorry. It's not a Mormon conference, right? No, God doesn't have a brain. Mormons believe he's physical. We don't. God is spirit, and those who worship him worship in spirit and truth. Huh. Hey, does God think? Yeah. Yeah, Psalm says his thoughts about us are more than the grains of sand. He's crazy about you. He thinks. Are you made in his image? Huh. Wait a minute. Brain thinks. Do you need a brain to think? Now, if you say yes, we're going to have to do this all over. But note the conundrum here. Can I be honest with you? That was a trick question. No part of your body thinks. Your soul has the capacity of a mind which thinks. But why is this a conundrum to us? Let me give you the brief answer. We live in a culture that is infiltrated with naturalism, but appearing to be neutral, and the church failing to have the eyes to see the stronghold. The culture says, look, we know that when there's neurological activity that happens when you think, so let's just say your brain thinks and let's be neutral. And the church says, look, as long as you don't talk about the soul or spirit, let us handle that in Sunday school. And yeah, let's shake hands, let's agree the brain thinks. And let's be neutral. That's not neutralism, that's naturalism. And yet we live in a culture, we let them lead in these areas. We say, yep, we engage in their language. It's the brain that thinks. And then we come Sunday morning, lift our hands, and worship a God who has no brain and thinks just fine. But we never let these two beliefs come together because we don't take our theology that seriously. Strongholds. You are the salt of the earth. So, substance dualism. I am a soul. What does that mean? I'll put it this way. I don't have a body, but quite literally, I have a body, but I don't have a soul. Literally, I am a soul, and a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. So on this view, I am the soul, and I have a body. Now, I actually have to be honest with you here. I've recently changed my position on this. I really have. Because a few years ago, I think I do now believe I have a soul, because a couple years ago, I bought a Kia Soul, and it's orange, and it's in the parking lot, and I bought that car just so I could make this joke, so if you can give me a better laugh, it's a very rich punchline, if you will. When I was looking for one, I was soul searching, and I found that, so I'm trying to milk it for everything I get. So, and it is parked out there. So let's look at this briefly. So we'll put it this way. Let's look at what my professor said. We'll close with this. To push the problem further, if someone gets brain damage, it will affect the states of their soul. Now, we didn't get into this, but put it this way. If what my professor is saying is true, then what he's essentially saying is that the mind and brain are the same thing. And to know whether or not he's correct, we look at something known as the law of identity, and it says this. If the mind and brain are the same thing, whatever is true of the mind is true of the brain, and vice versa. But if we can find something true of one that's not true of the other, we know they're not the same thing. In philosophy, if you want the big, long word to impress people after this conference, it is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. But we can just say Leibniz's law for short. And we'll put it this way. Suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid. One is labeled water, the other is chemical X. But suppose the label that said chemical X was ripped off, so you don't know what it is. And you want to know, are these the same substance? Well, using Leibniz's law, you look at their properties, and you say, well, they're both fluid, they're both clear, so I think they're the same substance. But suppose you turn over chemical X, and on the back you read a label that says, caution, flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, given Leibniz's law of logic, we know at the very least, what? They cannot be the same thing. See, you guys are philosophers already. It's great. Now, going back to this, what my professor said, would this prove that the mind and brain are the same thing? No, for one simple reason. Because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Here's what I mean by that. Suppose I'm the world's greatest guitar player. I'm not. But suppose I played guitar, and I popped a few strings, and because of this, I was unable to play my music. Would it follow from this that therefore I am a guitar? No. What would follow is that I have a cause and effect or dependency relationship between my ability to play the music and the guitar, but no, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing. If I were to break open the guitar, the guitar were to break and I couldn't play the note C, does it follow that if I broke it open, the note C would actually fly out of there? No. Can I open this piano and pull out the note C? No. But can I show you which keys are correlated with the note C? If I broke these keys, could I play the note C? Does it follow they're the same thing? No. You are an immaterial self, a soul, with the faculty of mind. And guess what? If you mess with my instrument, you affect my music. But it doesn't follow from that therefore I'm not a soul. It follows therefore there's a cause and effect relationship between my body and myself. Now, again, using these states would not prove these functions, these hindrances. Yes, they can affect my conscious states, but it doesn't follow they're the same thing. Why? Because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. Now let's break this down. End with this. I was talking to a non-believer once who I knew held to naturalism. And I said, let me ask you this. If atheism is true, would you agree with me that nothing non-physical should exist? He said, yeah, I agree with that. And I'm thinking, all right, that's all I need to hear. So that would also mean, if you're going to grant this, it would also mean if I can show you something non-physical does exist, well then guess what? By the same rules of logic, therefore atheism couldn't be true. And he says, well, like what? Glad you asked. If atheism is true, we can put it this way. Consciousness, if it exists, would have to be identical or reducible to something physical. Would you agree? He said, yes. He said, okay, great. Now, I explained to him Leibniz's law, and I said, but now note though, if I can show they're not the same thing, and if I can show consciousness is not physical, well then guess what would follow? Well then, atheism can't be true. I said, so let's take a look. I explained Leibniz's law, and I said, now let's take a look at this, because the question is consciousness physical? The short answer is no. The long answer is no with more O's at the end. It's a no. Good, thank you. I wasn't sure how that one would go. So let's look at this. Again, if the mind and brain are the same thing, given Leibniz's law of identity, whatever is true of one must be true of the other and vice versa. And it's trivially easy to show they're not the same. I can give you lots of examples. I'll give you 3. My mind, there are states of my mind like my thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false. But guess what? No part of my brain is true or false. It makes no sense to say that my thought is true, but the neurons firing in my left hemisphere are false. All we need is one example to show that there's a difference and we know they're not the same thing. But consider this one. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but my thought that I'm talking to you right now does not weigh 3 pounds. You may be having some heavy thoughts this morning, but you're not going to buy a neck brace at the end of this conference, right? My brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation in my mind, is not 7 inches long. Now, I was saying, now, Mr. Atheist, given this, it follows that if all the properties of the mind, or excuse me, the brain are physical, and other properties of the mind are non-physical, well, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, can't be physical. And given what you said earlier, if consciousness exists and can't be physical, well, then it follows that atheism can't be true. So my only question, I suppose, is, did you consciously decide to become an atheist? Because if you did, you shouldn't be an atheist. You are the salt of the earth. We have the truth. We are commanded, not suggested, to be ready to give an answer, to be the salt, and to recognize and rationally respond to the strongholds in our culture. This is what we aim to do at this conference. You're not going to get everything all in one day. But let this be a catalyst to equip you, to convict you, to encourage you to go out and be the salt, because not only do we have the truth, we have the evidence to present and defend it. As I mentioned, you can go to the YouTube channel. Love for you to smash that like button. If you want to take a picture of that, you're welcome to. You can get the slides of my notes. Last thing I'll say, that professor I mentioned. Anybody seen the movie God's Not Dead? Yeah, terrible movie. I hate that movie. But it's a similar situation to where 5 years after I graduated from that college, he was my first public debate on God's existence. It was from a third party. In a nutshell, I remember 2 weeks before the debate, the youth pastor who was organizing this called me and says, hey, I hope you're not offended, but they're going to put you in the gym. They don't think people are going to show up to this. So they're going to put you in the gym of the church. I said, that's fine. I've never done this before. I'm fine with it. And then I get there about an hour early, and he meets me at the door and apologizes again. And I said, what are you apologizing for? He said, they only put out 200 chairs. They really don't think people are going to be interested. And I said, well, that's fine. Again, I've never done this. So I go to the back, praying, preparing, look over my notes. As I peek my head out the door just to see who showed up, those 200 chairs were full. They put out 200 more chairs. Those were full. There were people standing along the back and the side, including an online audience. There were around 600 people that watched that debate that night, and there were more atheists than Christians at church because of how influential this professor was. If you get the package, I don't have it on DVD, but I'll give you the download card for that for free. You are the salt of the earth. Sometime afterwards, I went up to him and I said, I know you're an atheist, so I don't know how you're going to take this. But I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life, because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today. We have the truth. Let's be the salt. Let's defend it. Let's tear down the strongholds. Amen.